Okay, we are going to get started. Thank you very much for coming. We're happy to see such a full house. This is pretty exciting. So I'm going to introduce myself and our organization, and then Shannon's going to introduce what we're going to be talking about today. So my name is Erin Regan. I'm the president of the Penn Science Policy and Diplomacy Group. We do work in science policy, science diplomacy, and science communication. Basically, our goal is to teach students in STEM, also postdocs, about how to engage with these different fields, how to communicate your work and even the work of other people in various different scenarios under different mediums. And we also do a lot of capacity building when it comes to science policy and science diplomacy, teaching people what they are and how they, as STEM professionals and early career scientists, can engage with that process. So today we're going to be talking about policy memos. You have already seen the title. It's going to be very interesting, and Shannon's going to talk to you more about why science policy memos are so important and why, if you want to engage in policymaking and influence policymakers, you need to not only know what they are, but know how to make one effectively to craft your message so that it has the greatest possible impact. So with that, I'm going to bring Shannon out.
Hi, I'm Shannon. I am the policy co-chair of Penn Science Policy and Diplomacy. And so basically, I'm going to tell you really briefly why you should care about policy memos. So to put it really just simply, policy memos are the currency of the policy world. So anytime someone needs information about a topic, a legislator, someone in the executive branch, anyone, they find it out by having someone else write a policy memo about it for them. And then they read this policy memo, and these can be 1 page, 10 pages, that's more of a white paper. But this is like the way that you communicate with people in positions of power about information that they need to know. So last year, we were exactly where you guys are. Well, I don't know what your experience level actually is. Maybe you have experience with this already. But we didn't know anything about policy memos. We didn't know what they were, how to make one, anything. It's okay. But we put together this workshop on how to write a policy memo. We broke into teams, and we wrote a policy memo. I was on a team, and we wrote a memo about safe injection sites, because that's a very Philly relevant area. And we submitted it to the National Science Policy Network and Journal of Science Policy and Governance yearly memo writing competition. And we actually won first place. So after that, we scheduled meetings on the Hill. We went to DC, we lobbied, we got a bunch of experience with that. In the end, 2 presidential campaigns ended up incorporating our policy suggestion into their platforms. I don't know how much credit we can personally take for that, but it sure felt like we did something. And this is just a picture of us after we won first place with the thing. So all of that is to say that we didn't know what we were doing at all, even a little bit. But by just doing it, we ended up winning, and it got published in the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, and then gave us the confidence that we needed to schedule meetings and do all of this stuff. And so at the end of this workshop, we really hope that a bunch of you guys will commit to joining teams and submit your own memo to the competition. And that's it for me. We're going to move on to the actual workshop now.
All right, so that was why policy memos are important. I'm going to give a little overview of what exactly they are, what they look like, what they're used for, and how they are put together, what their structure is like. So memos are concise, they're audience-driven documents, and you give them to whoever your audience is in order to help them understand some specific science policy issue. They provide a range of options for the policy issues, policy approaches to solve this issue, and they break down those policy approaches a little bit, talk about their pros and cons of each alternative. And then at the end, they leave a clear recommendation for what your audience should do with this information. They tell them what the next action is. Ideally, it's very timely and it's very specific. So they can leave that policy memo and say, okay, here's what I'm going to do next. Now, I said that they're audience-driven, but what exactly does that mean? So policy memos are tailored to a specific person. So that might be, like Congressman Higgins or whoever your representative is or your state assembly person. It might be a position like a staffer in the office of Elizabeth Warren or something like that, or it might be an organization or more general institution. And they're also concise. We want policy memos to be as short and clear as possible because the people who we're giving them to are very, very busy. They don't have much time. They get a lot of this stuff. So we want to give them the exact information they need, the exact level of background, and have it be as easy for them to understand as possible. So there are a couple of little tests that people talk about to evaluate whether a policy memo is short enough, concise enough. People talk about the coffee test. So, whether you can digest and understand an entire policy memo, read the whole thing over your morning cup of joe, or the elevator test, where people say you can hand the policy memo to your boss or whomever on the ground floor of the elevator, and by the time they get to the top, they have understood the main points, the distillation of the main points, and they know what they should do next. So that's a big ask, but that's what we're going for with this concision. Also, policy memos should be actionable and timely. We want the audience to walk away with exactly what they should do next, when, and how they're going to do it. So because policy memos are so driven by these different factors, they're audience-driven, they're supposed to be as short as possible and have the exact specific background information that's necessary, there's lots of variety to what they look like. You might be giving a policy memo to someone who already knows a lot about a field, and maybe the background section's really short, maybe the whole thing is just a page, and you have a little recommendation at the end saying, okay, just catching you up on what's happening, what the options are, and you should take this option. Or you might have a really long policy memo that's giving an in-depth background because you're talking to someone who's not as familiar with the field that you're in, who's not as familiar with the issue, or you're really trying to change their perspective on this issue. So there's a huge variety of what these policy memos can look like. I'm just going to break down a couple of them, go through the constituent parts, and look at what they are made of. So this is an example policy memo from a group at MIT. It's just one page, about as short as they can get. And so let's break this down. So up top we have the header. This is just your logistical information. It's going to depend on exactly the format and the destination, but your title, who you are, and who you're writing to. Then this is the most important part of the policy memo right here. This is the first paragraph, the introduction, or the executive summary, whatever you want to talk about. It's going to contain a summary of your main points, and it's going to end with that action item, the main takeaway that you want your person to take from the policy memo. And yeah. The background is the next section. It's going to be audience specific. So you want this to just have exactly as much information to catch up your audience member to whatever the level they need to be to understand the evidence. Now this is going to be the meat of your policy memo. It could be very, very long and longer policy memos, but this is going to contain your data, your figures, in whatever method you think is best to present it so clearly to the audience. And then importantly, it's also going to contain these policy options. So options for the different ways that you could enact policy to address these issues. This is where you're going to break those options down, talk about their pros and cons. Finally, very important at the end, we're going to restate our main points. We're going to restate our action, and we're going to summarize the policy memo, leaving these people with, at the very end, their takeaway, what they need to do next. So here is a slightly longer policy memo. This is just 3 pages. There are more references, but this is actually a policy memo that was submitted to the National Science Policy Network memo competition last year. So this is the exact format that we're looking at if you guys are interested in entering that competition. But this is from a group in Georgia. Let's just break this one down. So up here, again, your logistical information, your title, and all that stuff. The most important part right here, the executive summary. This is your first paragraph. Again, breaking down those main points, laying out the action. This is going to be short and punchy, and you want to spend a lot of time on this section. A lot of times, this is the only part of the policy memo that actually gets read. So you need to convince people, first of all, that the rest of your policy memo is worth reading. And if they don't get to the rest of it, because they're very busy, you want to convince them that this is important, this is something that they're going to look out in the future for, and to do what you recommend. Here we have a nice meaty background and evidence section talking about the data, talking about the analysis of all of the different options that have been looked at in the past. They also take a look at the stakeholders for this specific policy issue, so who is going to be impacted by this. And then they get into the policy options here. They're breaking down the timeline and the path forward for these policy options. And then here they're laying out 3 different policy options, giving a little summary, their pros and cons, and finally ending with the action, the recommendation, the thing that they want to walk away with. So, as I mentioned, we've been talking about policy memos so far. This is just one type of policy publication. There's a whole broad spectrum of different publications that are out there. They have slightly different purposes, but I'm just going to break them down into 2 different categories to try to make that clear. So, the first type is the policy brief. Policy memos fall under this type, so this is what we'll be talking about today. But policy briefs are very audience-driven. As I said, they are 100% written for a specific audience. They're crafted specifically for that person, and everything, the content and the structure, is going to depend on that person. They're intended for this pool of people we call informed non-specialists. So these people know what they're talking about, but they aren't like experts in the field. They aren't researchers. They're policy workers. They're staffers. And they're a tool for advocacy. What you're doing is you're taking this policy memo, you're hopefully sitting down with a person and talking to them about this issue, convincing them, and then leaving them with the policy memo, which has all of the in-depth information that they can take away, they can take to their boss, for example. So they're usually on the shorter side, 1 to 8 pages. The other half of the spectrum is the policy study. And this is a much longer document written usually by experts. And you can think of it kind of as a literature review. If you're a researcher, you know, this is a review of the literature in the specific field, plus a little policy analysis on top of that. So it's driven by an issue. It's written by researchers who are usually researching a specific issue. They're going to break down the background of that issue. They're going to introduce some new research sometimes. And really, they're writing from an expert perspective to other experts. And they're using this document as a tool to influence expert thinking. So they're, writing all of this data, all of this jargon, in order to try to convince the rest of the experts, that this should be the new consensus. This is how we should move forward with this issue. And here's why. And they're much longer, 35 to 60 pages. We also talk about white papers a lot. These are sort of a weird thing in the middle. They're a little bit more written in an authoritative voice, usually by institutions of some scientific importance. And they advocate for, from a perspective on an issue. They're advocating for their own philosophy on an issue. So that's just to set those apart a little bit. All right, so that was an overview of science policy memos. Now we are going to dig in with the first in a series of exercises that we're going to do today. So in this exercise, we're just going to take 5 minutes. We're going to break into groups of 2 to 4 people, and we're going to pick a topic from the list that we've given you guys. It is, you can definitely choose your own topic. That's awesome. It's the first one on the list, but we've also provided some other options for you just in case. So yeah, 5 minutes to take a look at that, and then we'll move on to Civics 101 from Aaron.
Okay, does everybody have a topic? Has everybody converged on what they're going to be doing? Does anyone not have a topic? Oh, great. Good job, everybody. So I'm going to be talking about the structure of our governmental system in the United States, because we realize not everybody may be from the United States and maybe didn't grow up hearing about these things. Even some people who did grow up in the United States really didn't learn very much about how the government works. We recognize this. So really the reason that we're talking about this is because if you want something to happen, you look into this issue and you decide this is what needs to be done in the policy sphere, you need to know who can actually do that thing. Because if you write a great policy memo, but you give it to somebody who has absolutely no influence over that issue, nothing's ever going to happen. And so this is a really key part of memo writing. So just as an overview, you probably already know this, but there are 3 branches of government. This is relevant for the federal level as well as the state and local level, because you may be writing policy memos for those levels as well. But in terms of the power breakdown, specifically at the federal level, we have executive orders that the president can make, and these have the binding force of law over federal agencies, which are actually quite a lot of the policy sphere. They include the Department of Agriculture, Education, Energy, Health and Human Services, Urban Development, and the list goes on. So it's possible that you may want to write one for the executive branch. Also, in terms of legislation, when you're considering who has power over what, the president does have veto power, and this is also present at the state and local levels in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. They can prevent a bill from becoming a law. In theory, you can overturn a veto, but in reality, in this day and age, it's basically impossible. So consider what the president will do when you're trying to figure out if something will get passed into law. In terms of the legislative body, this is where most of our science policy work gets done. You can advocate for things at the executive level, but since we have less experience in it, we don't feel comfortable telling you how to do it. If you're interested in that, we're happy to work with you to figure out how to do it. The legislative body is the one that makes all the laws. These are applicable to everybody, not just federal agencies. They also, importantly, have the power of the purse, which means it doesn't really matter what the executive branch wants to do if the congressional branch doesn't give them any money to do it. There's also the judicial branch, which is important for many reasons, but outside the scope of this workshop. So, breaking it down at the legislative level in the federal government, there is the Senate. There are 100 senators in the Senate, and each one of them represents somewhere between 280,000 people and 19 million people. That's California, in case you were wondering. They all serve 6-year terms, and this results in the Senate being sort of above the day-to-day changes in policy and persuasions of the American people. That's sort of how it was built. By contrast, the House of Representatives has 435 members. Each one of them represents somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million individuals. So actually, there are some senators that represent less people than House of Representatives represent. They serve 2-year terms, which means they're basically always running for re-election. So they are much more responsive to what's going on in the public sphere. And this can, in some ways, make them better people to approach when it comes to writing policy, and in other ways makes it worse because they're much more beholden to the whims of the people, for better or worse. So in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, there are committees. These are very important when it comes to policy memos because the vast majority of bills never make it out of the committee stage. All bills go through the committee process before they get to a floor vote, and so you have to think about who's on the committee, who has the power, and in most cases, the chair has complete and total power over what even gets discussed or considered. So it doesn't matter how someone would vote if the chair never brings it up for a vote. So this is something to think about. At the state level, we have the Pennsylvania governor, who is Tom Wolf. We also have the General Assembly, which is sort of like a mini Congress. There are 50 senators instead of 100. Each one of them represents about 250,000 people, and they serve a 4-year term. At the federal level, it's a 6-year term. And in the House of Representatives, there are 203 representatives. They each represent about 60,000 people. And just like at the federal level, they serve 2-year terms. And so they're a little bit more responsive to the will of the people. In Philadelphia, we have the mayor. And then we also have the city council. This is built up of 17 individuals. 10 of them represent specific districts of Philadelphia, and 7 of them represent the entirety of Philadelphia. They serve in an at-large capacity. When it comes to the at-large individuals, 2 of those seats are reserved for non-majority parties. So traditionally, those 2 seats have gone to Republicans, but starting this year, one of them is actually held by a Working Families Party member. These people all serve a 4-year term. So this is a flowchart that I made. We're not going to go through it because it's outside of the scope of this presentation. However, we're going to have an entire event that goes into a lot more detail about this whole process of figuring out who can do the thing you want and how do you target that specific person effectively. On March 4th, you will all be getting an email about it. It's called Navigating the Legislature. So this is a bit of a complicated topic. We understand it's very intimidating for some people. It was intimidating for us, and so we figured we need to learn how this works and then teach everybody else. But just as an example, I'm going to go through one bill that recently went through the legislature in Pennsylvania. So the topic is on gerrymandering, and the first question here is, have any bills been introduced on this topic before? This is a great way of understanding what's going to happen to your bill if you get it introduced, so you can sort of follow along what happened before. So in this case, the answer is yes. In 2019, Senate Bill 22 was introduced, so that's great. Now we can think about things like who introduced it and who co-sponsored it. In this case, it was Senator Steve Boscola, and it was co-sponsored by 14 other senators. So all of those people may potentially be willing to reintroduce it if you can talk to them about why it's going to work this time, because if it worked last time, it would already be a law and you wouldn't be writing a policy memo about it. The other question is, what committee did it go to? Now, there are rules about what bills go to what committees, but the rules are sort of wishy-washy, and in a lot of cases, it's just the whim of whoever controls that body of legislators. So if the Speaker of the House decides that it should go to this committee, then it goes to that committee. And it can be difficult to predict which one it's going to be since it's up to that person. So the best way to know where yours is going to go is look at where they went last time. So in this case, the committee that it went to is the State Government Committee, because gerrymandering is about how they divvy up different districts. That's a state government issue. And then you want to think about who controlled the committee at the time. It was controlled by the Republicans. Actually, both chambers at the Pennsylvania level are controlled by Republicans. And the person who was the chair at the time was Senator Mike Fulmer. He actually was a co-sponsor of this bill. And as a result, it did get voted out of committee. Now, power hasn't shifted since then, although there is a new chair for reasons that are quite salacious. The person who used to be the chair was arrested on child pornography charges recently, so he got replaced. Now there's somebody else who is on the chair position, the Senator John DeSanto, who is also a co-sponsor of this bill, which is still a good sign. So those are things to think about. This actually was a bipartisan bill, and so it had a lot of support from both of the two parties. And the people on the committee now, it's still controlled by Republicans, but there are 10 Republicans and 5 Democrats on that committee. And so all of those people, as well as the chair, are people you might consider when you're trying to decide who are you going to send this thing to. Once you know who the people are themselves, it's possible that they're not your representative. And so how do you get them to listen to you? We're going to talk more about that in the next section, but a good first step is figure out, do they have any sort of alliance or friendship with somebody that is your representative? There's some data to show that if 2 people serve on a committee together and they're in the same party, then they're likely to be friendly with each other. And so if the person you're targeting is also on another committee with your representative, then they may be a good person to talk to because they can influence their friends. So these are all things we're going to talk about a lot more at the March 4th event, but you all have this flowchart as a handout. Okay, so now we're going to do another exercise where you're going to get targets, because choosing a target is a whole process in and of itself, and it's outside the scope of this workshop, so we're just going to give you one, and you're going to figure out how to make it work for that person.
Yes.
So everybody is getting a target, and there's a lot of information on that sheet of paper. Your goal is to think about ways that you can align that person and their priorities with the topic that you chose. There is no right or wrong answer for this. Everyone will have different conclusions that they come to, but this is all a very important part of figuring out how to write a policy memo, so just think through the process. You have 2 minutes.
Okay.
Alrighty, everybody. Good. Bring it back. Would anyone be willing to share sort of what they came up with, like what their topic is and who they're doing and who they're thinking about targeting? Yeah.
So we decided to do the decriminalization of drug test kits in Pennsylvania, and we have targeted the health committee in the state legislature because they seem to be amending the Controlled Substances Act in the states. So I think that would be the way to go to get the paraphernalia not be like criminalized.
Right. That makes sense. Anyone else?
I heard some good ideas when I was walking around.
What about you, Hirsch? What are you thinking?
So we're doing improved cybersecurity for renewable energy grids. We got this guy from Hawaii, Hawaiian senator, and this topic is particularly important for Hawaii because they get about 40% of their energy from solar, and they're also like isolated from the rest of the United States. So their like energy security is particularly important for them. So we figured we could target one of his staffers specifically because he's on a bunch of security subcommittees as well.
Very good. And we have one over here?
We have exactly the same.
And you have the same rationale?
Pretty much. And we noticed all the committees that he's on. And also Hawaii is a very nice island. You might want to keep it that way.
Right. All right. So I'm going to be talking a little bit now about who actually your audience is, because obviously whenever you're writing something, you need to be very aware of who you're actually writing it for. There's no general purpose, any piece of writing, but in particular, there's no general purpose policy memo. You can be very aware of who you're targeting. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about Senate staffers, because we're talking about the legislature, and I also had a friend who interned in a Senate office and had some insights about that. But so a Senate office usually has a few interns, and they mostly just answer the phones. They do read a little bit of correspondence from constituents. And then you have what are called legislative correspondents, and there are, on average, 3.5 of them per Senate office. And they do the bulk of the reading of letters. They answer phones a little bit, and they're the people who, if you mail in your memo, will probably be the ones reading it. And then there are legislative assistants who are higher up on the food chain, and they're sort of tasked with the senator's positions on broad policy areas. But I want to emphasize these are very broad. Like all of healthcare is what someone will be responsible for, which is really big. And they're the people who you really want to be reading your policy memos. And if you do what they did and go to a Senate office, who you'll run into is a mixed bag. They even ran into a couple actual, or had appointments with a couple actual senators and representatives. But for the most part, you'll be dealing with legislative correspondents and legislative assistants. And so who actually are these people? So first off, like a lot of Washington, they are very, very white. They're a little bit biased towards being male. For the most part, they're single. These are legislative assistants, so the higher up people on the food chain. They're roughly 32 years old. And they're a little bit overworked. So a lot of them have more work than they sort of expected according to their job description. There's an average of 1.4 LA per million Americans. They've usually spent about 3 years in LA and 4.4 years in Congress total. And they make roughly $80,000 a year. Something to note here is that most people just have bachelor's degrees. Some people have master's degrees, and a few people have law degrees, but very, very few people have PhDs. And another thing to be aware of, I couldn't find any statistics on this, but the vast majority of people studied humanities. There are not a lot of people in these roles who have science backgrounds. But these are the legislative assistants. These are people you sort of want to be reading your policy memo. If you look at legislative correspondents, they're a little bit different. In particular, they're basically like people our age who sort of just graduated from college. They're all single. They're 25 years old. They've basically, this is the only role they've had in Congress. And if you do the arithmetic, the LAs basically, they were LCs, and then they were promoted to LAs. They make not a ton of money per year, at least not compared to probably what their peers in other fields are making. And they're pretty overworked. They also basically only have bachelor's degrees, and again, like these people are mostly humanities degrees. Why would someone care? Like, if you are trying to sell someone on a policy position, why do they care? It's like staffers, they're going to care if their boss cares. The LC cares if the LA cares. The LA cares if the legislative director cares. The legislative director cares if the senator cares. So ultimately what you have to do is you have to cater to the elected officials. And there are sort of three main reasons why they would care. If you're a constituent, they'll listen to you. And this is a big problem, is sometimes if you're not a constituent, they won't even hear you out unless you have some other connections. So it's really great if you can make an appointment to actually go and talk to them so that they don't just like throw away your letter or something. The other thing is if they have a special interest in the issue. And this is actually surprisingly important. So when they took their memo to the Hill, it was about safe injection sites and why they're a good idea. And there was one senator who is a veteran. He served in the armed forces, and he's very into veterans issues. And so a really great way of selling something like this would be to talk about like how the opioid epidemic is affecting veterans in particular. Because even though everyone's district has veterans in it, he was particularly concerned with the affairs of veterans. And there are some people who, what they care about, they care about certain things. And so there are some people who maybe are interested in balanced budgets. And so like they're sort of nodding along. And then you mention how much money something like this is going to save on hepatitis C and HIV treatment for people. And suddenly they'll start paying attention in a way that they really weren't before. Because you talked about you're not even asking them to spend more money, you're telling them how much money they could save. And then the big thing, the case that you really have to make most of the time if you can't find a special interest in someone is how what you're proposing is going to affect the health and prosperity of their constituents. Like, that is really what people care about here, and this is the case that you need to make. So how can you be heard? Basically, you need to answer these three questions. What is the problem? But you need to answer this very clearly. Remember, these people have humanities backgrounds largely, and so you can't use jargon. You can't assume that they have much technical background at all. You need to be very understandable about how you're conveying this information. Secondly, you have to make the case as to why they should care. How does it affect the health and prosperity of their constituents, or how does it play into some special interest that they have? And thirdly, is you have to tell them what they can do about it. It really doesn't matter how much they care about something if they're not in a position to do anything. And so this means you need to be able to say something like, I would like you to introduce this legislation that I have attached. Or like, there is this bill, House Bill 25, and I would like you to support it. Or I would like you to talk to your buddy in this other committee and get them to support it. It needs to be super concrete. They need to know what they can actually do. But the other thing is they need to know all these things in the first paragraph, because these people are really busy, they're really overworked, and so they need to see all these things, which are what would make them pay attention to you really quickly. Something that's interesting to look at is there are some eye tracking studies that show how people read. And so often what you'll get, and this is like a web page, and they do some eye tracking, and people read the first paragraph, and then they read nothing else at all. So this may be what you're faced with. And so you need to, when they are reading the first paragraph, that introduction or the executive summary, like really get them to pay attention. Like they really need to see why it's important. You don't need to go into any technical details there. This isn't to say there shouldn't be technical details backing up what you're saying. There absolutely should be. You need to think that there are sort of two different ways that people are going to read this. If they already care, maybe they'll assign someone to actually read what you're saying. But at first, you really need to get them right away. And the other thing is, even if people do read beyond, people have a tendency of skimming. So here's another web page, and people are reading, they read the title, they read the first paragraph. But then as you go down, you'll see they start only reading the first bits of paragraphs, sort of the topic sentences. And so you really need to be aware of this when you're writing, and there's a sense in which these bits need to be cohesive on their own. Because you need to be aware of the different audiences and the different ways in which people are going to be reading your memo. So now we should take 5 or 10 minutes, and based on the the topic you've chosen and the person you've chosen. Think about, and maybe if you can, write out 5 to 6 sentences that basically answer these 3 questions is a sort of cohesive introductory paragraph. And like obviously you don't necessarily know all the details of this topic. It's okay to sort of make things up that are plausible, but it's a good exercise to try and actually do this. So take 5 or 10 minutes here.
All right, let's finish up. Focus up here. You get the chance? All right. Cool. So, how was that for you guys? Good? All right. My name's Jake, and we're going to be going through a memo example. We've done a lot of talking at you guys. Now we're going to put a memo up here, and we're actually going to get into it. But before we do that, I would like to see if there are any of you would like to share what you just wrote with us. So who has an example that they're proud of, that they think is okay, that they're not embarrassed to share? There we go.
Yeah, so we're working on trying to reallocate oil subsidies to renewable energy production, and we're targeting Senator Amy Klobuchar, who, and she should care because Minnesota is a leader in producing energy from wind, but it still only accounts for 9% of the overall energy consumption in the state. So trying to target an increase to up to like 25% of the wind energy portion would be would induce a lot of growth and economic development in the state, and also would empower rural communities and farmers to produce energy locally if you subsidize renewable energy production, and of course climate change, which is a big concern for everyone. What can they do about it? Well, Senator Klobuchar is a member of the subcommittee on rural development and energy, so she could introduce a bill to reallocate some of those oil subsidies to renewable energy.
Okay, great. Yeah, you make it relevant to, you take the problem, which is, we need to invest more in green energy. You make it specific for the constituents of the senator that you're targeting, and then you have a very specific ask for them to put something forward that would be effective. Great job. Yeah.
I have a question. So what's the etiquette around senators who are on a committee introducing a bill that's probably going to get steered to their committee? Is that taboo or is that common?
It's fine. Yeah. As far as I'm aware, I haven't ever heard somebody say you shouldn't do those things. In fact, for the example that I went through, the person who was the chair was a co-sponsor, so he wasn't the person who wrote it, but he was on the bill in the first printing, and that wasn't an issue.
Okay. Does anybody else have one they want to share? That's okay. We'll move on. Cool. So now we're going to get into some examples. But before we do that, I just want to review the things that we're supposed to be looking at when we read a policy memo, the things that you're supposed to be thinking about. The first things we need to do, you need to be, when you're writing this, you need to make sure that the audience can understand the issue. Remember, we're talking to these legislative assistants, all these people with their humanities degrees who definitely don't have the background in this issue that you do. So you need to make sure you use clear language, and you need to make sure that you don't put any jargon or anything in there that somebody who has no background will read and be like, well, I don't understand this, and throw it away. You also need to make sure you tailor this towards a particular audience. The people who you are asking to do things matter. If you ask somebody to do something that they can't do, it won't get done. So make sure when you're writing this memo that your recommendations are within the purview of the people that you're targeting. Extra things to consider, writing style, unfortunately, is very important. I know as scientists, this isn't our strong point, but we need to focus on proper grammar, verb tense, using the active voice. Do we know what the active voice is? Mm-hmm. Okay. As an example, the active voice versus the passive voice, right? So an example of the active voice would be, I failed my qualifying exam, versus the passive voice, which is the qualifying exam was failed by me. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but if I use the passive voice, I will likely fail. So, important to think about. And just concision and clarity. Don't have anything in there that doesn't advance your point. People will get confused easily, and then they have a million other things to be working on. So if you have extra information in there, it's not going to help you. Finally, towards the end of your memo, you're going to have these policy recommendations. You're going to say, we want you to do this thing, or this thing. And one strategy that we found to be effective was to kind of have this Goldilocks zone of policy recommendations. So you have your desired policy outcome, and then you also have a more intense or less intense policy recommendation as well. And these can they can go on either side of your primary recommendation and make it look better by comparison. This doesn't mean go crazy. Don't take it to an extreme, but find secondary policy recommendations that are both more and less extreme than your desired policy. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's move on. So we are going to look at this memo, the Baltimore Clean Air Act, the need for a new waste management system in Baltimore. You guys have it in front of you. This was another of the entries into the JSPN contest that we submitted our memo to last year. This was one of the honorable mentions, so I want to state that this is still a very good memo, but there are definitely some imperfections with it that we're going to look at. One thing that I wanted to do is based on Stephen's interesting heat mapping exercise. We're going to look at this memo and we're going to take some parts out of it that you may read on your first skim through. So here's the memo. Here's what it looks like. I have gone in and simulated a heat map, various things that you may go and look at as you're going on your first read through. We're going to pull them out and put them up here. So what I want you guys to do, look up here, take 2 minutes, I'm going to time it, and we're going to read it and then we're going to talk about it. So go. 2 minutes. We've got 1 minute left. Finish reading and start to think about the answers to the questions down here. Because I want you guys to answer them, not me. And time. All right. So, one thing to notice when we look at it in this way, when we just pull things out, the transitions don't make a lot of sense, right? It's kind of choppy and difficult to understand. That's not necessarily anything that's wrong with the memo itself, but when people are reading things, they don't have, when they're skimming, they don't have the context of everything that you said before, unless they happen to read it during their skim. So that's important to understand and make sure that your most important points are in the places that people are going to look as they're reading their first time through. So, what's the problem? What problem are the authors here trying to solve? Yeah.
Widespread air pollution in Baltimore.
Widespread air pollution in Baltimore, absolutely. So that's a big issue, and they would like to They like to get rid of it. What else do we have? What are the recommendations that they're putting forward?
Reduce the subsidies that are being given to incineration.
Okay, so that's one of them. What's another one?
Try to reduce waste in general for businesses and residents.
Okay, and what's another one?
Update their waste handling infrastructure.
Update their waste handling infrastructure. Okay, and what about, I don't know if we can get up here. What about this guy right here? That's a third, right? So they want to update the, they're changing the designation of these waste plants in the General Assembly of Maryland, right? So here's something that I want to point out here. They have two recommendations that are very local. They're definitely something that the city of Baltimore could do. But then their third recommendation here is something the Maryland General Assembly is going to have to do. So already, if you're this memo that you're giving to people, depending on who it is, they will not be able to do everything that's on this memo. So when you're writing, you have to be very sure about what you're doing. So what we're going to do, I've pulled out a couple of passages, and I'm going to ask for volunteers. So somebody's going to read this out loud, and then we're going to critique this based on the writing itself. So who wants to read? I will choose somebody. Okay, there you go.
Introduction. Baltimore City suffers from widespread air pollution with large contributions from the nearby waste-to-energy WTE incineration site. Set up as a green option for waste disposal, the Wheel Operator Baltimore facility gives a modest energy return while releasing greenhouse gases and harmful pollutants at a similar level to the average landfill. In addition, highly toxic incineration byproducts, including particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, lead, mercury, and manganese, are released by the facility, posing a significant health hazard to local inhabitants.
Okay. There you go. You don't have to finish that last sentence. Baltimore City. Okay. So, what do we think about this? Is there anything here that stands out as something that's good or something that you maybe shouldn't have done?
I stopped paying attention after they said like nitric oxide, sulfur dioxide, lead, mercury, blah, blah, blah.
So that is a good point. Yeah, so that's one of the things that I brought up. That's jargon, right? We don't know what all that stuff is. Somebody with a humanities degree isn't going to know what all that stuff is. You know, I study biology. I don't even necessarily know what that does specifically. So using all of these terms is not going to be effective. So I also thought that this sentence here, the historical background was a little confusing. They were saying it was supposed to be green, but then this whole proposal is about how what they currently have is not green and we need to make a change. So anything that is going to confuse people and make them not fully grasp your argument needs to be removed. All right, who's next? This guy.
The Baltimore City Council recently passed the Baltimore Clean Air Act, targeting Wheel Operator Baltimore and the nearby medical waste incinerator Curtis Bay Energy. Wheel Operator Technologies has publicly stated that the new regulations will force the facility to close. With the goal of reducing waste incineration to zero over the coming years, this legislation is a step towards improved local air quality and public health. The removal of incineration options for waste disposal, however, poses a new set of challenges. Proactive measures are a necessity to combat the inevitable increase in landfill capacity demands.
Okay. So I'll show you guys what I highlighted here. So first, I want to talk about down here. Finally, we're getting to the real point of this memo. It's buried at the end of the introduction, but the removal of incineration options for waste disposal poses a new set of challenges, and we need to take measures to combat the inevitable increase in landfill capacity demands, right? This is a clear statement. This states the problem and what it is, and it should be far earlier in the memo than it actually is. And this just seems like a kind of a long sentence that could be said more concisely. All right, let's go to the next one. Volunteer. There we go.
Recommendation number 1, encourage waste reduction by businesses and residents. Baltimore City should use financial incentives to reduce waste from businesses and residents. much of what is thrown away does not have to be. Nationwide, 28% of all waste can be composted, but the vast majority ends up in landfills. In 2017, the city recycling rate was below the rate required by the Maryland Recycling Act. Encouraging residents and businesses to reduce and sort their waste will cut down what has to be sent to a landfill. More than half of all municipal waste was burned at Wheel Operator before going to Quarantine Road landfill. The unburned waste went directly to the landfill. Baltimore City has the opportunity to greatly reduce its waste and improve public health by moving away from trash incineration.
Okay, cool. So here's what I have here. This is the last one of these we're going to do because we're running out of time. But I thought this was good. Baltimore City should use financial incentives to reduce waste from businesses and residents. It is a specific ask. It's saying what should be done. If I'm reading this, I understand what the authors want me to do. I thought that this was a sentence that didn't have to be there. And then this was kind of a long, confusing sentence that didn't add much to the argument. So we're going to skip ahead. Spare you some of these. We didn't know how much time we were going to have at the end. So we'll be done. Okay, takeaways. Your asks must be specific. You have to be careful of unnecessary exposition. We're scientists. We want to explain everything. Everything needs to make perfect sense. You don't have to have all of that context. You just have to get the main points across. And make sure that when you are crafting your recommendations, they are effective for the people who are going to be reading them. Okay, we'll skip that. A quick note on figures. So, figures do have a place in your policy memos. We had one in ours. They're a good thing to have. But you need to... The same considerations for figures go for when you're writing, right? So you need to keep it simple, label everything clearly, avoid abbreviations and jargon, and if possible, make your point on the figure, right? These figures, you have to have the safety rails on for people who don't understand science. So we're going to go through two examples really quickly. One, first off, if you're an immunologist, I apologize, don't feel targeted. How do we feel about this figure for a policy memo? No, absolutely not. Yeah, it's busy. There are tons of abbreviations. We don't know what it's talking about. The axes are confusing. Just never put this in a policy memo. That's what it comes down to. This one, on the other hand, how do we feel about it? Good. It's much better, right? So you have the points put above. You have important information that would not be known to a person who's reading this presented on the figure itself. You have the current level, you have the 1950s level, and you can see it very clearly makes your point without being too confusing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shannon to talk about the competition itself.
Okay, so